Let's get started. So first, you're probably wondering, why are we calling it a playbook? Well, we talked about policy frameworks over the 3 years, action plans, blueprints, green papers, white papers, and so forth. And I think people were tired of all of this language. So after a few drinks, few conversations, we came up with the idea of calling it a playbook, which makes it a little more playful, even though it's a deep, hard issue that we've all been working in. But we checked it with the partners. They said, go for it. And we all liked it. So a playbook really sets a shared goal, which I'm going to talk about. It translates the vision and strategy and actionable plans. So to Chris's point, we need to get pragmatic and we need to move from theory to actual practice. It moves beyond theory and into pragmatic steps. It helps define the players' roles and responsibility. It tells players what they need to do for the team to advance. It gets everyone on the field moving towards the same goal, and it offers winning strategies. So I love it. It's positive language. It gives vision and direction. It's pragmatic. And so really, in essence, this playbook was written as an as an implementation strategy for the government of Alberta and the Impact Collective to help both move towards primary prevention actions in different ways. So first, it lists plays and specific actions for the government of Alberta who, through legislation, policy, and funding, can help create the conditions to prevent the perpetration of violence. And as we all know, we need lots of government leadership and civil servants to deepen their commitment to understanding primary prevention across departments and ministries, because as we all know, it cuts across every ministry and department. So their leadership is critical to advancing primary prevention efforts in Alberta. The playbook also contains plays and actions for Impact, which is the provincial collective backbone organization that has over 300 anti-violence organizations as members. And in 2020, as many of you know, Impact committed to investing its time and efforts in moving their prevention efforts upstream to identify and address the root causes of violence and agreed to prioritize primary prevention as their core work. So overall, the playbook articulates our understanding and case for primary prevention. It explains the root causes and drivers of violence and offers 4 big plays with specific actions that the government of Alberta and Impact members can undertake over the next 5 years to move towards changing cultures and structures that produce and enable perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence. So how did we get here? A lot of work, a lot of time from a lot of people got us to this point. So we created and conducted 35 research projects over the duration of the project. Impact hosted dozens and dozens of consultations and meetings. The 3 partners met often throughout the project. In consultation with Impact, we designed 5 online primary prevention learning models that were funded by Silver Gummy. There was 10 of you that were deeply engaged, testing, redesigning. It was awesome. And we're getting very good feedback on those modules in terms of impact on knowledge and awareness, which I think helps people to start to shift their thinking from traditional intervention to primary prevention. Together, we developed a theory of change, which informs the primary prevention priorities in this playbook. And note, that's our theory for today. That may evolve as you go out into your agencies and communities. That might evolve over time, but that theory of change guided our priorities and the 12 reports that I'm going to talk about that really give you the actions and strategies on next steps. Shift in the Impact Policy Working Committee created 12 action plans, strategies, and recommendations that can be found on our Primary Prevention Playbook website, which we'll share with you shortly. And also, both of us have created websites to support primary prevention throughout Alberta. And both, I think, are important to help advance the conversation and get people the information they need as they think through how they, depending on their place of work, their sphere of influence, how they can leverage and advance primary prevention. So the purpose of the playbook is to provide plays and actions for the government of Alberta. And the Impact Collective and here's part of our theory of change that will eliminate drivers of violence. So we talk about gender inequality, social exclusion, and colonization. There are other drivers and root causes, but that's the ones we focused on. We also, while reducing risk factors, and a lot of Stephanie's research and work was focused on that, and then increasing protective factors. So these are buffers to support and prevent violence for women, equity deserving groups, and Indigenous peoples through policy legislation and initiatives targeting norms, systems, and behavior change. So that's the purpose of the playbook, is to provide plays and actions for the government of Alberta. I see we didn't write that correct. And the Impact Collective that will eliminate drivers of violence while also reducing risk factors and increasing protective factors for women, equity deserving groups, and Indigenous peoples. So in order, that was the purpose. We had to create a theory of change, which then identified the root causes. And then, of course, this drove our 12 research reports. So let me talk a little bit about, because I just want everyone to know that there are 12 foundational research reports influencing the playbook. So as I talked about addressing the root cause of violence, there's multiple root causes, but we focused on gender equality. So we wrote a gender equality plan for Alberta. We wrote a strategy for the government of Alberta to promote social inclusion with equity deserving groups. We wrote a specific strategy for impact to be able to advocate and promote social inclusion with equity deserving groups. And then our Strong Women's Circle, we have a map of the root causes and policy recommendations in 6 areas to support Indigenous self-determination. So those reports were to address the root causes. The other reports address specific populations to prevent violence. So we've created a comprehensive provincial strategy to engage and mobilize men and boys. We've created an action plan focused on preventing child maltreatment and adverse childhood experiences, because it's a key place to stop intergenerational trauma and abuse. And we also build a case with evidence-based actions that we can build if each Albertan becomes an active bystander and knows how to challenge the normalization of violence within their own spheres of influence. So this is the informal supports work. We can advance and change culture at all different levels of society. And so this continues on a key place for populations. And then there was reports that are focused on specific forms of violence. So we created a primary prevention of sexual violence action plan, as it is the only violent crime in Canada is not declining. We agreed it needed to be integrated and distinct within this project, so the specific form of violence. We heard from Corinne on what they're doing with that information. And then we also identified early on technology facilitated violence. And I remember people are like, why are we doing that as our first report? But the government of Alberta early on asked us to prioritize this area because they were actually doing some work in this area. And as we all know, there's been so many, like really since 2010, the emergence of technology facilitated violence and the constant emergence and changing of this has had a huge impact on lots of people. And our sector at the time hadn't really prioritized or focused that, wasn't integrated into assessment. And we haven't really played a major role in technology and whether regulation or changing the culture around technology. And so we worked on this project with other experts from around Canada because this wasn't our area of expertise. And so we had to lean on the YW Canada, LEAF, and some other groups and some other experts in Canada that had been thinking and doing some work in here. And also you'll notice when you go into that report, there's a lot of recommendations for federal because that's who actually regulates technology. But Julie, we hope that the province will start to play a significant role too. And we hope the sector will take on some of the work and the recommendations around this area. So the last few reports, we wanted to address risk factors and promote protective factors. And this is where Stephanie's expertise and research really focused. She created a suite of policy recommendations on financial and economic supports to build protective factors for women and equity deserving groups. And she also did another report where really integrated health, food, housing, and climate change, because we all know those things are risk factors but can be protective factors as well. And so encourage, Stephanie's worked hard with the Impact Working Group, and I think there's 2 solid policy papers right there that Impact and others can look at to see what policy pieces we need to put in place, what should we be advocating for or prioritizing right now. And then the last one, the government of Alberta was interested in benchmarks and accountability and how do we measure success or change over time. And so we did some research, we built an accountability framework. It was specifically designed for the government of Alberta to start to think about outcomes and indicators for monitoring over time, violence prevention. So we encourage, as you think about your own implementation strategies, this might be another report that you'd want to look at indicators and measures, because we do need to create some solid benchmarks over time to actually understand changes over time. And so we haven't done that. I don't think any province or territory has done that, but maybe with the bilateral agreement with the National Action Plan, the federal government and the provincial government are in bilateral agreement talks right now. When that comes out, maybe hopefully some portion will be focused on how are we going to measure change and what's the change we want over time. So what happened to the Alberta Primary Prevention Policy Framework Collaborative? Because originally we were going to write a shared policy framework with the 3 partners, that's GOA, Shift, and Impact. But lots changed over the duration of the project. Because remember, we launched this in early 2020, then COVID hit, and I probably don't need to say more. Like, things changed significantly. So originally we had created a process where we would produce a primary prevention policy report, one of those reports that I just shared. It would go to Impact and GOA. They both had their structures and processes, and then they would review it, provide recommendations, provide feedback, think about the priorities for their own org. We'd come back together and we start to design that framework. But that process, and that was supposed to be a 6 to 8 week process. And I think we overestimated how much time this would actually take. And so it was our hope that each collaborator would review the report, select priorities, and then start to integrate we would start to integrate a broader plan that we would have a shared policy framework. But so that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. But instead, we decided that we'd take the information as needed. Each partner would use it as they can within their own spheres of influence. And so today, I'm going to take you through the playbook because this shifted what the policy framework was supposed to look like to a playbook, which was written now specifically for the GOA and Impact, and it's an implementation strategy. So our hope is that as you go through your strategic planning processes as a collective, and as the new ministries are being built and priorities being set, you will use this information that you find valuable. So as mentioned earlier, we saw ASAS and Corinne explain the process of what they're doing. We hope others will do what they need to do to integrate some of the recommendations and learnings that make sense to them. Okay, let's talk about the playbook. So I'll talk, the playbook is structured. I did a summary. We wrote a summary. So there's a kind of an executive summary. And then we talked about understanding the foundation of the game. So these are key concepts, terms, and definitions, and some of the limitations of the playbook. We then have a section called Assessing the Playing Field, which really gives a lot of data and stats, which all of you already know. And so I'd encourage you also in all the reports that I just talked about, all the data and stats are there. So if you need data and stats, they are in all the reports. We then move to the actual playbook, which provides a goal, 4 plays, and then specific actions we're recommending for the government of Alberta and Impact. That also includes a series of indicators and measures of success. So how we know we're doing well, what are the indicators or measures of success? And then in the appendices, there's the methods, how we designed it, the examples of primary prevention in action, because there's lots of stuff already happening in Alberta. We also have 8 policy domains. We have quick wins for the government of Alberta that they could integrate fast to deal with risk and protective factors. And then, of course, a glossary of terms and definitions, along with hundreds of references. So that's how it's structured. So I'm not going to go through each section, but I'll talk briefly about each one, because I think understanding the foundations is super critical. So first, this is the opening page. We believe perpetrators are made, not born. That is the central philosophy of this approach. And it's the central idea to the playbook. So that means people who perpetrate domestic and sexual violence are created. They're created in our families, in our schools, in our peer groups, in our neighborhoods, in sports, in religious communities, at work, in our institutions, through media and culture, through wider inequalities, and because of the systems of oppression in which we've all been socialized into. So that's capitalism, colonialism, heteronormative patriarchy, and white supremacy, and many more. So if collectively we want to stop producing perpetrators, because that's what this playbook is about, of domestic and sexual violence, we must focus our attention on disrupting the pathways to perpetration. So that's why we're focusing on kids and their family and so forth. By changing, this is the shift to our work, the cultural and structural conditions that produce, promote, and condone violence, inequality, exclusion, and discrimination. So really proactive change is the focus of this playbook, and it's starting to shift us out of individual change to systems and structural change to create the conditions to prevent perpetration, right? And so this is the shift to the work of primary prevention. So we had a lot of definitions, and over time, Leanne's work and Anya, we kept reworking our definition of primary prevention, but ultimately landed on this for the playbook. Primary prevention means changing the cultural and structural conditions that create opportunities for perpetrators to commit violence, while eliminating risk factors and building protective factors to stop initial perpetration of domestic and sexual violence. So this means, again, if we want to stop producing perpetrators of violence, we must transform our cultures. So those are our values, beliefs, and social norms, and our institution, laws, policies, and practices. So the structures, right, that we all operate in that create and enable them. And I mean, this is a big definition. We worked with Michael Flood. We've been trying to really Winta Gide, who was working with us. She really looked at all different types, and we've been back and forth consulting with impact members as well on this, but this is where we've landed. We know primary prevention is long-term social change work that should involve every citizen. And it's our hope that the playbook starts to create a critical mass of leaders and a workforce that is really focused on this work, ending the perpetration of domestic and sexual violence. So really, primary prevention is the quest to prevent the perpetration of violence before it happens. We know all prevention work is important. And really in Alberta, we know that there's now readiness to focus more of our efforts in this area. I just want to point out throughout the project, early on, the partners agreed that equity deserving groups would be centered. We did some research and work to identify equity deserving groups, and I'll let you all read this to yourself. So I'll just give you a minute. This is where we landed. And I know there's a limitation because some groups may be left out. And in the playbook, we hope and encourage research and primary prevention efforts to support other groups that might not be in the playbook. But because of time, prioritization process, what was happening in Alberta, these were the groups selected. So in those social inclusion reports, you'll see specific policy, legislation, practice changes specifically directed to supporting these populations. Okay. So that gives you just some common terms and definition. The next part of the playbook is really around assessing the playing field and what do we know about domestic and sexual violence. So in the playbook, we were told there was too much data and stats. So we kind of condensed it to a few pages. But we know that violence is prevalent and affects many Albertans. And we know since COVID, it's actually exacerbated, right? The rates and severity. We know violence is gendered. We know it disproportionately affects certain populations, specifically equity deserving groups, women and girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people. We know violence costs everyone. So there's that data and stuff in there that really is the case for primary prevention. So what that means is it's time to remove the burden from victims and focus our attention on the people and systems that cause harm, because the cost of raising perpetrators hurts everyone. All right, I'm going to stop us there for a minute. Is there any questions because I'm going to head into the goal of the playbook and the 4 plays. Is there any questions up to date that grounded the foundations?
Just as people might think of some questions, Lana, I wanted to highlight a couple of things in the chat. So in terms of focusing on perpetrators, Diana said, I just love this starting point. So it's so important. And I think you definitely got it right. Corinne also posted a message just outlining some of the steps, the initial steps that ASAS is taking to use the research and really implement and influence what happens within this sexual violence sector. And Andrea apologizes, but had to leave a bit early. So I just wanted to summarize some of the things happening in chat.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Awesome. Thanks. Are you good to keep going? Okay. So we're going to head into the goal of the playbook. So here's the goal of the playbook. It really is about building a team of innovators, change makers, and pathfinders within the Alberta government and Impact Collective committed to addressing the root causes of violence while addressing risk factors and building protective factors to stop the perpetration of violence before it starts. So that's the goal. We have 4 plays. 1, we have to educate ourselves and all Albertans on the root causes and drivers of domestic and sexual violence, meaning we have to understand it so that we can, I think, having a shared understanding within ourselves, the sector, and in the broader community is really critical to getting at change of like structural and cultural change. We need to invest in and grow a primary prevention workforce. We need to adopt strategies that are now focused on changing cultures and structures that make violence possible. And then we want to actually change the game. We want to invest in game changers that eliminate the root causes of violence. And I know many of you have read Jen Wright's book, around the 4 pivots. It really is about one thing to be reducing and, suffering. It's another to reimagine the possibilities. And that's where we want to get to. And we have some ideas on how to get there, but no more work will need to be done. So I'm just briefly going to go through, because each play is set up the same. So the first one is understanding the game. How do we educate ourselves and Albertans on the root causes and drivers of domestic and sexual violence? So here's where I'm going to also give you a moment to read. It's the theory of change. And it's one of the most important pieces, I think, in the playbook, because it's bringing all the thinking that we've done together. This is where we think our theory of change is, which then directs all the strategies and recommendations. So I'm going to give you a minute to read it to yourselves. Can you see it okay to be able to read it on the screen? Or, yeah, okay. So we worked really hard together to unpack this social problem and critically examine the entrenched mental models all of us have that prevent us from seeing that violence is not individual in nature, it's not inherent, and it's not unavowed. In fact, we've come to understand that culture is critical, the systems of oppression and working on root causes is critical. And to advance that work, I think we have to change our strategies and our focus to get at prevention. And so that's the purpose of the theory of change. So the actions needed by the government of Alberta and the Impact Collective to actually implement Play 1 is complete the 5 shift to learn primary prevention modules for a common understanding. It's really critical that we move, outside of how we've been trained in our worldviews to start to think about the issue and problems differently. We support co-hosting a series of biannual strategic forums with impact members and policymakers. It's important that we come together from diverse ministries to continue to learn and engage in generative conversations and organizing this in ways that are really around problem identification, unpacking, and the policy and legislation pieces that need to happen. It's also raising awareness and strengthen advocacy efforts between sectors and industries, going beyond the anti-violence sector, working with leaders. And we know a lot of workplaces are taking this issue on. We know a lot of sectors. We're doing work with policing throughout Alberta. There are groups who want to work on root causes and drivers of violence. And so how do we start to go beyond? And I know many of you do. Your organizations already do that. And then the last one is co-develop and implement an awareness campaign that includes key messages on the root causes of drivers to educate and mobilize all Albertans to become part of the anti-violence movement, but to give them pragmatic actions and steps in which they can do to prevent violence in their own spheres of influence. So how we know our efforts are making a difference? Well, we'll see that policymakers and impact members will have increased knowledge of the root causes of the perpetration of violence. We'll see that policymakers and impact members will have increased capacity to engage in systems, culture, and policy change. And I know many of you are working with Mark Kabaj and others. I know you have another event, I think, in the fall, which is great that you're trying to move the capacities and skills of many people to do this kind of work. And that more Albertans will be committed to stopping the perpetration and normalization of violence within their spheres of influence. So we'll see more people who can disrupt, but not just disrupt, but amplify the positive and pro-social behaviors we want to see. So how we measure the change, you'll see this in each section where we have the play, a series of recommendations, and then how we'll know if our efforts are making a difference and how we'll measure the change. So these are recommendations to both impact and government to think about a measurement system. You'll see a number and percentage of impact members and government workers who have completed all the Shift to Learn modules and have a shared understanding of primary prevention and the root causes of violence. We'll have a number of community-based agencies and organizations funded to implement these efforts in Alberta. We'll have a number of awareness and education campaigns delivered to Albertans on the root causes and drivers and the solutions, right? And disrupting trajectories of violence. And then the percentage of Albertans that understand the root causes of violence perpetration and are committed to stopping the perpetration and normalization of violence. So lots to unpack there, lots of different surveys and ways to collect this information. But that's the first play. And I wonder, it's probably a lot to take in. And again, we'll be sending out the playbook and all the resources so you can have some time with it. But is there any initial thoughts? That's how we structured each play. With the play, the rationale, you know, the recommendations, then ways we're going to measure, and so forth. Any thoughts?
I just have an initial thought, Lara, just that initial play there, it's very much aligned, I thought, with early impact strategic planning conversations related to public awareness and capacity building amongst Albertans around prevention of violence.
Yeah. And, you know, the research out of public campaigns too is there has to be alignment. So if government's coming out with a public campaign, hopefully regionally and locally, the campaigns are matching, because sometimes what happens is there's so many different messages and right, Frameworks calls it a swamp and people just aren't sure what message to listen to. So thinking about moving forward and having the government and impact aligned on some of the key messages, I think, and campaigns would be super important. I also think a public awareness campaign is great, but people are actually wanting pragmatic skills. And I think you're naming the moment campaign, Corinne, and what you're doing in workplaces is giving people the actual skills to understand it, disrupt it, but also amplify positive pro-social behaviors that creates an environment that people won't commit sexism or won't, you know, perpetrate. So
yeah, Impact talked a lot about like calls to action, and that capacity building amongst Albertans. And yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Leanne, is there anything in the chat box that
there are a couple of things. So after reading The Theory of Change, Dr. Stephanie Montesanti said this is so beautifully and clearly articulated. And then some, not Brielle, but somebody that has Brielle's name said the clear articulation of and focus on root causes is vital and so exciting. So thank you. I'm really sorry. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the name, but there you go.
Great. It's Carla. Thanks, Carla.
Carla. Thanks, Carla.
Awesome. Okay, we're going to head into play 2 now. Can you see it okay? So let's move to play 2, which is around preparing the playing field, invest in and grow a primary prevention workforce. And I was looking at Australia and our watch and this notion of a primary prevention workforce, which I think we're trying to build with Shift to Learn. You're trying to build an impact. And I really think we had to consolidate. Well, like, what does that actually mean and how do we get there? So I think the success of Alberta's efforts to prevent domestic and sexual violence really depends on the size and strength of the primary prevention workforce and the capacity of this workforce to innovate, design, develop, plan, implement, monitor, and evaluate primary prevention initiatives. So to grow an expert workforce across the province, the government of Alberta and Impact, or the anti-violence sector, I think needs to commit to investing in an infrastructure of people and organizations and provide tailored training and professional development opportunities while improving the overall working conditions within our own organizations, right? We need to make sure that there's psychological safety, well-being, inclusion, diversity, gender equity, and so forth within our own organizations. So the actions needed by the government of Alberta and the Impact Collective to implement Play 2 is to actually invest in a workforce development plan, outlining the infrastructure, so the funding, the strategies, the policies and actions to build and retain a skilled prevention workforce. I think it's critical. A lot of us have been doing one-offs or off, like often many of you are under stress to deliver intervention and been testing and designing and trying to do primary prevention. I know there's some tension in that. I think really thoughtfully thinking about what is a skilled workforce, what are the components and capacities. We need to invest in that, just similar how we invest in other areas, right? So that's the recommendation for Play 2. So some other actions that are needed to implement Play 2, we need to also fund and support professional development opportunities to create a cohort of primary prevention practitioners with the knowledge and capacity to change systems and structures that create and sustain the perpetration of violence. And I think Impact is doing that with Mark, and I can't remember the guy's name out of New York, that you're trying to really think about what are those capacities, how do we look at systems and structure change, which is awesome. But I think what has to happen in this, you can't do this work without critically examining our own assumptions, values, norms, and beliefs and systems and the stuff that we may be doing that reinforces harm and biases. And how do we support others and to do that? Our sector is not immune to this, right? So it's also about how do we work with communities to shift social norms and change culture that enable violence. We're not funded to do culture change approaches, right? So understanding how to do culture change has to go hand in hand, I think, with policy and training, right? So I think a lot of things have to happen, a lot of capacities. We need to learn how to map systems, identify levers for change, bring people together to get at that. So I would also add in this, I think data literacy and leveraging technology and how to use data is so critical for gender and social justice. And I think that's a core capacity that I think many of us are thinking about as well. So I think there's lots in there. We have specific ideas on the professional development opportunities, and I'm sure you'll have more as you work through it. The third one around actions needed to get to Play 2 is also about improving the overall working conditions in our sector by ensuring all our organizations, ministries, and departments actually have healthy policies and practices, right? So we have healthy workplace climates, that we're committed to pay equity, pay transparency, comparable wages and employee benefits, that we implement gender responsive and accessible, age-friendly and family-friendly workplaces, parental leave, and so forth, that we continue to support and invest in our professional and personal development of our employees, and that we're actively engaging in reconciliation and decolonization processes to apply anti-racism and anti-oppressive frameworks throughout our workplaces. So really this play is about doing the work within, figuring out, are our own environments and organizations healthy? Do they provide psychological safety? Are they diverse? Have we decolonized? Are we moving towards reconciliation? Do we have strong policies to support the whole person? So I think that is a core. We're asking others to do that, to create the social conditions to prevent violence. Are we doing that within our own organizations? So that's a recommendation as well. We have to look within. So how will we know if our efforts are making a difference by implementing these recommendations? Well, we'll have a strong primary prevention workforce plan that has funding and supports and a different reporting system, because this isn't traditional programmatic work. So we need to be thinking about our reporting systems. We have more Albertans and organizations that have the knowledge, skills, and motivations for leading and doing primary prevention, and that we have more healthy workplaces that actually support equity, inclusion, and safety from violence that we can then model and share with other sectors. How will we measure that change? There'll be new money, hopefully, and funding allocated to dedicated primary prevention positions, primary prevention learning opportunities that we talked about, the piloting and testing of new interventions that actually target culture and systems change within workplaces or other settings. We have increased capacities to engage and mobilize more men and boys in violence prevention, equity, and inclusion. We pulled out this population on purpose because they are critical to stopping perpetration, because as we talked about, violence is gendered. And that hopefully there'll be some thinking done around a new evaluation and reporting requirements. This doesn't match traditional programmatic psychoeducational programs. This is really community development, systems change, culture change work that does not, there isn't like, it's not a rational, logical, linear approach, right? And so those programmatic designs, those program logic models don't necessarily work in this type of work. And so really need to think about how to properly evaluate and what we're evaluating. That then impacts the funding mechanisms on what reporting requirements are required. They need to be different. So how will we measure the change? We'll see more safe and equitable, inclusive workplaces in the field of violence prevention. We'll see the number and percentage of impact on provincial government employees reporting discrimination or unfair treatment in the workplace, reporting psychological safety, including a healthy environment in the workplace, reporting a healthy life-work balance, reporting improved working conditions. And also they have increased employees' pay and implementing family policies. And there's many more in that, but wanted to give you a taste of what we could be looking at and thinking about, measures organizationally, in business plans, and in the ministries. Okay, that's a lot. Wondering if there's any feedback on that one. So really, it's a workforce development plan, building the capacities and practitioners to actually engage and lead primary prevention efforts. So maybe in 5 years, there'd be core, like in a lot of our organizations, there'd actually be a core department or, you know, that are doing this work. Any thoughts or comments? Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Lana. So this section, firstly, all of it so far excites me, just to clarify, but this section for me personally, I love this section because I think without a healthy, robust workforce that is well compensated and ready to go out and do the work, we've got nothing to be able to actually move the lever of change. And then also the talk around the need to look at and measure primary prevention in a different way, and having that different strategy, I think, is just so critical. So, you know, like thumbs up or a gold star. I'm really excited about what I'm hearing thus far, and this piece has got my heart.
Yeah.
As we come out of pandemic, but I think that it's also a piece that, yes, it's been exacerbated with pandemic, but it was a challenge before. For sure. And I agree, Chris. I think really focusing on what is it? What do we need to be doing? What are the competencies and skills, and how do we get there? Building a map. We can do that over 5 years. Like, so in that, I would love to see in 5 years, a core group of people in Alberta that have those skills and abilities to advance that. And we have to invest in people and our workplaces. And I think we have to stop over promising and do less, but have higher impact. And I think that's hard for all of us because of who we are and the work we do and how much we care. But I think it's important. I think Corinne had a comment. Leanne, I saw something.
Yeah, she did. So this play very much aligned with ASS's next 5-year strategic plan and with the work of our national association, EVA Canada, National Advisory on GBV, worker wellness.
Awesome. That's so great to hear that alignment.
Also add, Lana, like Chris, I'm really excited about like measurement and evaluation, and my one, like, you know, my one trepidation is that it's resource intensive to do that on top of, like, you know, the 23 funder reports in this next year, you know what I mean? And that evaluation and impact measurement is an area for some devoted resources within our sector. I think it's, you know, I can see that as the next focus area of work, and so we can do it. I think we just need the resources to do it.
Yeah, I agree. Hopefully with some of the new funding coming with the National Action Plan to Prevent Gender-Based Violence, you know, maybe there'll be some dollars set aside to support primary prevention. Go ahead, Chris.
If I could just piggyback off of what Corinne said, I think that it's more than we can do it. We actually want to do it. We want to do it. We want to know that our programs and services are doing what we think they're doing. And with the resources, we would absolutely love to do that in the way that would make sense, and both prove us right and prove us wrong, and find those little hidden nuggets. So yeah, very exciting, and agreed. I think with all of these strategies as we move forward, they're going to be great, and then the resources to do it.
Yeah, and then the implementation strategy with that too. Yeah, I agree. It's great. Thanks, everybody. Just because of time, I'll head into play 3, which is really rewriting the rules of the game and changing the cultural and structural factors that lead to perpetration of violence. So just so you know, we've identified in all those reports 60 legislative recommendations, along with more than 500 policy shifts needed today to address some of the root causes and drivers of violence. So all those reports contain all of them. And it's a lot. So I think that's where I think Corinne and Impact, like synthesizing it down to what makes sense, and then going forward with the current context. And now we have a new government, right? Ministries and so forth. What are the priorities on their business plans and the mandate letters when they come out, like really thinking strategically on what to move on. We also identified a series of policy recommendations with Stephanie's help, really that are in 8 domains that really the government of Alberta can implement today that would address many risk factors and build protective factors for women, Indigenous peoples, and equity deserving groups. That's one of the appendix, and I encourage everyone to read it. It's short, but I think those pieces could immediately be put into action to help, as I mentioned, reduce risk and increase protective factors. So in this play, we broke it into 2 distinct strategies, one that's focused on the government of Alberta, and then one that's focused on impact. And we'll start with the government of Alberta. So in this, we're asking that the government of Alberta form a cross-ministry primary prevention policy working group to actually review the 12 reports in depth that were completed as part of this project, then to consult with specific groups, because one of the things in criticism is, well, lots of reasons why, but we couldn't get out and didn't get out to actually consult outside of with Indigenous elders and researchers. And we use Indigenous research. For the other groups, we didn't pull together equity deserving groups and consult with them on the priorities. And so it still, I would say, needs that step. We need to include people with lived experience. And what Corinne talked about, they're synthesizing, then taking it out with people with lived experience. I think we can't miss that. Impact shouldn't miss that approach, either should the GOA. So we're recommending that as they understand and really dig into the research, consult with the groups and people with lived experience, and then integrate that feedback and prioritize and update and adopt the legislative and policy change and new investments that are required. So again, these still need some oversight, these reports. So I'll give you a few examples. We've recommended all 12, it's in the playbook, but one, we know that there's already a Premier's Council on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. I'm assuming it's still going, Stephanie, with this new government. But what we're saying is the Strong Women Circle report that we did really looked at systemic issues that lead to the victimization of Indigenous peoples, including poverty, homelessness, lack of transportation, discrimination in education and healthcare systems, and the fact that they're overrepresented in every system of sorrow. And together, because there's already a structure and process, there is a Premier's Council on Missing and Murdered, taking this work, integrating it together and working together. So we'll be working with Native counseling services, in terms of with impact and community, but this is really a recommendation that this gets integrated and shared. And I think Julie's been part of some of those meetings with the elders, and we'll talk more about that next week, but it shouldn't stand on its own. It has to get integrated into the work that's already happening. Another example is taking the recommendations in the Advancing Gender Equality report and the Sexual Violence Plan, and together to get at patriarchal and misogynistic views, norms, and practices, they need to actually be working together. We wrote a lot of reports because it was hard for us to group it all together. So we kind of went, as I mentioned, we went root cause, specific populations, and risk and protective factors. But each of those reports need to be reviewed, and some need to review together because they complement each other. And then the last one is really advancing social inclusion to address systemic discrimination and racism that increases the likelihood of equity deserving groups victimization. There are some quick wins and there's some deep hard work that has to happen. And I would say, obviously, since COVID, and we're seeing high rates of hate and misogyny, both in public and online and in all sectors, this really is important, I think, to prioritize in our work. As I mentioned, There are 8 policy priorities for the government of Alberta. So hopefully with the policy analysts on today, as you're thinking through, I think there's some quick wins in a suite of policies that could be taken up quite quickly. So how will we know if the government of Alberta has been successful in implementing Play 3? Alberta will have a provincial gender equality plan, a provincial social inclusion plan, a provincial strategy to prevent violence with Indigenous peoples that is focused on systems change, a primary prevention plan to eradicate sexual violence, and engaging and mobilizing men and boys. I think you see where I'm going. A comprehensive strategy to prevent child abuse, an engagement strategy to empower Albertans to prevent domestic and sexual violence, a strategy to address technology facilitated violence, and so on, a suite of economic and social well-being policies. So, and then of course a benchmark. So basically it's taking the 12 reports, government doing the review as needed, and then meeting with people with lived experience, and then solidifying an actual policy framework and report with investment. So how will we measure change? Well, we'll see a new government of Alberta policies and legislations that advance primary prevention, and a number of new initiatives that are actually targeting the root causes along with the risk and protective factors. I'm going to quickly jump to the Impact Collective, then I'll take questions. So for the Impact Collective, to address cultural and structural factors that lead to perpetration, our overall recommendations to Impact is create working groups in the priority areas, review the reports, reflect, sense make, integrate, translate, revise, and customize, consult with people with lived experience and other relevant groups, identify priorities, implement the strategies, whether it's through policy advocacy, piloting practices, and then of course evaluate. So again, the key priorities, that areas that merge, preventing sexual violence, that ASAS is leading right now to synthesize the priorities. And hopefully when that's done, Corinne, you'd bring that back to Impact to get their support and allyship. Same with preventing violence against Indigenous people. We're working with Native Counseling Service, and we're going to continue to socialize that report, and hopefully Impact members will become allies and support the implementation of the recommendations. Same with men and boys, the informal supports, parents and caregivers and children, obviously. And then some of the work that Stephanie led around really what are the risk factors, how can we reduce risk factors and increase protective factors for women and girls and equity deserving groups. So we're kind of saying the same thing to Impact and GOA. Get working groups together, review it, consult out, come back, prioritize. And you can prioritize at a provincial level, maybe for federal, maybe at a local and regional level, right? It's whatever makes sense for the group. So how will we know it's been successful? We will see significant policy and increased engagement and advocacy efforts that promote primary prevention, safety and inclusion for women, equity deserving groups, and Indigenous peoples in public and private sectors, and among all Albertans. We also have a series of how we can measure success. So the number percentage of Impact members that are implementing sexual violence prevention initiatives, that are supporting Indigenous peoples, decolonization and Indigenous sovereignty, that are engaged in initiatives to engage men and boys, that are working with informal supporters, all Albertans throughout, and working to increase support to children and youth, because we know they're critical and they've kind of been left out of our anti-violence efforts in terms of, yes, we have good system to respond if a child's experiencing abuse, but how do we prevent and what do we do with them after we don't have a clear strategy in Alberta, a comprehensive one? And then, of course, engage in an advocacy for policy change. And I know this pushes us outside our comfort, but healthcare, financial and economic well-being, climate change, housing, food insecurity, all those create risk factors, right, for violence or experiencing violence or victimization. So any questions before I move to play 4? I know that's a lot, but again, all the details will be in the playbook. I just really wanted to take you through the structure today. Any questions?
Lana, can I just hop on and just really reiterate something important that you talked about in terms of the recommendations for both GOA and Impact? And it was the second step really about reviewing, reflecting, internalizing, translating. And I think based on my experience working in this area and having to sometimes be the translator, I cannot emphasize the importance of that, because there's the research, but the sense making, the embodying, the internalizing, and then getting that information into a format and into messages that people can actually hear within our own spheres of influence cannot be underestimated, you know, and I think that that's linked to the capacity building and the workforce that you talked about earlier on, but how, you know, the resources, the time, the dedication that's required for that before you even start consulting is just so important. So I just wanted to emphasize that. And I see Chris with their hand up.
I guess I can't help myself with questions. My question is, there was recommendation that both community and GOA or government create working groups to address this. Are you recommending separate groups or a group together? The reason I ask is stepping back to the comment that you held before, which is the need for the communication strategy to be on point between all levels of society so that we're not getting confusing. So, but yet I felt, and it just could be how I interpreted it, that the recommendation was to have separate. So I'm curious as to what strategy is being recommended.
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. So we broke it up into two ways, but I'm hoping that there's integration and overlap. You're absolutely right. So we wanted to have, because there is a interministerial policy working group. We wanted a working group specifically on primary prevention, which means they have to have a certain capacity to even read this stuff, right? Like, and so that they can interpret. And I think what Leanne said, like the sense-making translation, look against what they currently have to what they could be doing. And then we recommended a series of working groups with impact. My assumption with impact was you have government policy people on that. So I just assumed in your working groups, you would have all your different members on it. And from what I understand, and into the policy group, and maybe Julie, it's a great question. I think it's an internal policy working group. I'm not sure there's external members on that, but maybe that's something that needs to be rethought. So thanks for bringing that up. I don't know if Julie's still with us. Maybe she's gone. Oh, she may have left. Okay. So yeah, I'll bring that up, Chris. But my assumption was in Impact's working groups, there is all Impact members, right? Which you have GOA at the table.
There is, absolutely. And we have GOA at the table. I was just curious from the broad perspective where that lies. And Julie, I think she is still here, but I'm not sure.
Yes, Julie's here.
Yeah. Oh, hi, Julie. Sorry. Any thoughts on that? Because we kind of did say, look, GOA needs to have their process. Impact needs to have their process. In Impact's process, you have GOA people on it. But in GOA's process, I think Chris is like, yeah, there isn't maybe community in there.
Yeah, currently we've got, it's one of the longstanding groups, and I think most people would be aware of the Interdepartmental Committee on Family Violence. And so that is it's one of the, I think it's probably the oldest cross-ministry group. And completed a refresh. It's got 4 sub-working groups right now, but certainly there's an opportunity as we move forward to take a look at accessing that and taking a look at a broader approach. So look forward to bringing this forward.
Mm-hmm. And remember, Chris and everyone, these are recommendations. I'm hoping you'll get that great. I think we can even do it better. I hope that I think you're raising a good point. And I wanted to reiterate that at this meeting, this is our best thinking to date. We may have missed stuff. I encourage everyone to dig into it and then make it their own. And so if that is a request that comes out, Chris, I think it's a good one. How do we ensure, is it a working group off of the Interdepartmental Committee? Is it a new group that gets created for specific pieces of because I think in some way Impact needs a government relations group or committee, right? Or yeah, so I think the structuring of it, or you create groups for specific priorities. I think you got a lot like constellation model. Like I think there's a lot of ways to organize depending on what the problem you're trying to solve.
And I'll just add, sorry, one of the things I'll add is Impact is specifically funded by government for this process. So as we talk about taking this work into the next phase, we have the opportunity to focus that funding to create the deliverables and to create the strategies through Impact, because that is what the primary prevention lead and positions that we have funded through SAGES, we can talk about what that looks like. And yeah, I think that would be very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Great. Awesome. Okay. We only have 7 minutes left. So I'm going to blow through a few things. The last one is really around changing the game, investing in game changers to eliminate the root causes of violence. So to stop the perpetration of violence before it starts, we need radical solutions that address the problem of violence, not at the surface, but at the root, at the systems of oppression that create the conditions for violence. So change those systems and you change the game and enable the creation of a different violence-free world. However, because changing entrenched systems of oppression is challenging and long-term work, game changers are rarely a primary focus of our collective work. But if we want to eradicate violence, we need to be ambitious, adventurous, and invest in this kind of long-term effort. So our recommendations to get to a place where Alberta has an equitable, inclusive, and violence-free Alberta. First thing is we need to invest in a data surveillance system that focuses on perpetrator. This really flips the script. We need better data to understand the trajectory of perpetration and identify prevention points to actually disrupt perpetrator trajectories. So the government of Alberta can fund multiple partners while impact members can bring their expertise and experience to actually the design of a data surveillance system. So this would include surveys to map personal, social, and structural motivators and drivers of perpetration, a baseline benchmark on the prevalence of perpetration, a provincial minimum data set. Early on, I worked with all the different ministries to look at the data that they were collecting in this area, and there wasn't very much, and we need even just a minimum data set. We need data literacy initiatives to help all of us, better collect and aggregate data to support primary prevention. And I also think we need to leverage AI and technology to predict patterns and use it to inform policy and practice change in real time. The second recommendation is to invest in a series of conversations with thought leaders, pathfinders, and individuals with lived experiences to promote systemic thinking, collective action, and innovative prevention strategies. And we've written out some areas and questions to get us started. These may not be the right ones. We encourage you if there's others, but how do we mitigate ongoing economic and climate change impacts and create an innovative and effective safety net for equity deserving groups? Because we don't have one. How do we regulate and shift our online culture? This is such a big question, towards gender equity and inclusion, and that ensuring technology is used for good. How can we challenge such views in a constructive, non-alienating manner and involve people who currently support such views into building a more peaceful and equitable society? Really, that's about the divisiveness we're experiencing. How can we bring people together to get at solutions? How do we support Albertans to rebuild social connections when most of us have got used to very limited social interactions, especially since COVID? Isolation is on the rise, as we all know, and it's a risk factor. And then how do we support people to make sure they do not abuse substances to deal with their trauma or with socioeconomic challenges such as unemployment, poverty, and isolation? And then how do we implement prevention efforts when our anti-violence sector is also in crisis and requires investment to meet the existing demand? I mean, these are big questions. They're examples of we need to take the time to start unpacking and having these generative conversations and bringing other stakeholders and players in. So how will we know we are successful in Play 4? We're going to start to see policies informed by real-time predictive data on trajectories of perpetration. We're going to see a flourishing ecology of innovative initiatives that promote a more just and violence-free equitable Alberta. And we're going to start to see the reduction and eradication of root causes of violence perpetration across Alberta. How will we measure it? Hopefully we have a robust surveillance data system around primary prevention efforts. We have publicly available data on perpetrator prevalence and mapping. We have perception studies. We have a reduction in the wage gap between the care economy, that's us, and other sectors, and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of recommendations on how we can measure success, but of course it'll depend on the questions. So it would be great if government, impact, and other leaders, and we create a way to bring people together on these big questions. And I know there are many organizations throughout Canada doing this. So thinking about how to hook into some of that or how to create that. Is there any questions on 4? It's a big one. I think you'll need time to read it, but it really is starting to get at the structures and systems of oppression. How do we reimagine a new way of being, and what are the structures and systems we need to support that? All right, I'm just because of time, some next steps. So there's been a ton of information generated throughout the project. As mentioned, we have 60 legislative and 500 policy shifts, plus lots of practice change and investments needed. We encourage each of you to read and dig into the areas that matter to you and encourage those that can to get started on whatever resonated for you in your communities. We encourage you and your staff to complete the online modules so we can, because we know there's lots of staff turnover. So it really helps to have a shared understanding. And I know staff come and go, but these modules really do ground important concepts and ideas to move primary prevention in Alberta. Ultimately, we hope Impact and government will use the 12 research reports, plans, and priorities and strategies in your own strategic planning processes. And we hope that the GOA will create a cross-ministry policy working group, as we talked about, to start to integrate and leverage some of the policy recommendations. And of course, we hope that each of you will use the resources, challenge them, embody them, change them, make sense of whatever makes sense for you and the people you're working with. Ultimately, we hope the playbook provides some ways to move upstream so we can get to the next chapter of our work. So we look forward to hearing from government and Impact in the fall on where you plan on taking this important work. And I want to again thank everyone for your participation in this big 3-year project. I want to acknowledge, and Leanne will, I think, put in the chat box the website, the link to the 12 reports. It's also here. And so that each of you will have time to review it. And here's just a quick snapshot of our website that you'll be able to download the playbook. There's a printer-friendly version as well. Then all 12 reports will be here. So again, I want to thank everybody. Did I finish on time? 11 o'clock. Sorry, I know there's probably more questions, but today was really about the process, how we got here, what's available, and a big thank you. And I think what Chris said at the beginning, like, we need to celebrate as well. This has been, all of you have spent so much time and energy in this. And I know it hasn't been easy in moments, but I feel we've gotten to a place and have a lot of resources that we can start to unpack over the next few years. So big thanks to everybody.